Hello, in today's session we're going to talk about which cloud service is right for your Java apps. My name is Theresa Nguyen. I'm Program Manager in Azure Compute Team and here joined by Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Compy. I'm a Program Manager in the Azure App Service team. Happy to be here with you, Theresa. So what are we going to talk about today?
Okay, let's dive right in. We're going to take a look at this presentation about how to host Java applications in the cloud. In this particular instance, we're going to take a look at Azure. So we're going to break it down to three major categories here. You have IaaS, which is Infrastructure as a Service. There's two products here called VMs and VMSS, which stands for Virtual Machine Scale Set. The next one will go to Kubernetes as a Service. There's two services in here as well. Arrow, which is Azure Red Hat OpenShift, and AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes Service. And last but not least, we have Azure App Service. So going from the cloud, from on-premise to the cloud can be a little tricky, and knowing how and where and which one to migrate to, the benefits and the drawbacks, it can be daunting at times. So understanding this will help you make a better decision. So hopefully in this session we'll go over some of the types of application we support, why, the pros, cons, benefits, and all that. So do you want to add anything to this, Christina?
Sure, yeah. So we're going to use JBoss EAP as a common yardstick across the services. So just to help describe the services better, want to be able to have some common factor that you can compare against all three deployment types and hosting service types. So in our case, we'll pick something a bit more complex, and we decided to go with JBoss EAP. So before we dive into each of the services, let's highlight a little bit about, though, how people host things on premises. So customers host their workloads in a variety of different systems. They use virtual machines, they use hardware, in some cases they even use containers. And if you've already made the jump, that's great. Good job on already making the early migration. The systems you use may be hosted within utility closets, or set-aside lab rooms, or perhaps you're on the higher end of things and you've got leased data center space from a vendor. So, these are all challenges you have to work through as you move to cloud hosting paradigm. A lot of these systems that people use were also developed organically over the years. The developers who wrote them have probably gone to other jobs, or maybe you bought it through a contractor or vendor who may or may not have maintained knowledge on the product. Either way, you're looking at systems that have gone stale, making it more of a challenge to move your workloads to the cloud. So the point there is you don't want to incur a lot of change when you make your first steps. The other part that's a factor is as there's mergers and acquisitions. As we all know, your software systems get wired in with their software systems, and you get these massive monoliths that remind me of the brush in my backyard, all tangled and interwoven together. And how do you untangle this and move to the cloud? That's the challenge. So to help talk to some of the things you keep in mind, let's start describing some of the different service types. Theresa, you want to walk us through infrastructure as a service?
Sure. So let's take a look at IaaS. As Christina mentioned earlier, you want to make the least amount of changes possible as you migrate from on-premise to the cloud. So having this parity from on-premise to cloud is important. So in the Azure setup, we have two services called VM and VMSS. VMs are standalone machines. You can run them as standalone configuration or in cluster configuration. Depends on your application. The other one is VMSS. This is an infrastructure that's designed to scale horizontally. This is great if you're running a retail store and you have your deployment that's running, humming along, and if there's like a major event like Black Friday where you need to scale up, you can do this and don't have to worry about deployment failures or anything like that. So within VMSS, you can scale in two ways. You can do it manually, where you can grab the slider and slide it from your minimum all the way to 1,000, or you can set the numerical value. The other way is through automatic scaling, where you can set it by number of instances or by metrics, and you can set the default value as well as the minimum and the maximum. This is great if you want to just deploy something and leave it alone and let it work. So within the VMSS, we support templated deployments, and these deployments are JSON scripts. It will provision all the resources you need to spin up your VMs. Without this template, you can do it yourself, but it will take anywhere from hours to days to deploy because it depends on your skill set and how much you know Azure. And the next option we have is the marketplace deployment. These are images provided by our partners or jointly developed with Microsoft, and this is for customers to spin up an image with their pre-configured software already deployed and gets them ready to go. And other ways we support images or applications is through custom installation or custom hosted images. So these are not all inclusive, but these are the four major categories of applications that we support within Azure VMs and VMSS. So Christina, maybe let's take a look at what kind of Java apps we support. Can you help us understand that?
Sure, let me take a look at that. So within Azure in particular, we've got support for several Jakarta EE or Java EE products, including JBoss EAP, which is our example app, WebLogic, WebSphere, and even Tommy. We also host Tomcat, Spring, and Jetty. Now, these are the things you can get readily out of our Quick Start templates and Marketplace, but you could basically deploy anything you want on virtual machines. You're not limited to this. If you wanted to bring your own Pojo product and slap it up there, that's fantastic. You can do that. If you wanted to take an on-prem Glassfish system and you've got it in a VHD, you could, of course, throw that on virtual machines. These are the ones I've got noted are the ones that we have a better experience built around, at least within Azure. Different cloud vendors can vary. The common model is that, of course, with IaaS, you can basically host whatever you want there. So talking a little bit about the JBoss example that we've got in Azure, we've developed it with a partnership with Red Hat so that they could provide integrated support. This allows customers to host production workloads on Azure with the same level of support that they got on premises. Microsoft supports the infrastructure and Red Hat supports the JBoss installation. The customer experience is pretty nice where you can bring the same subscription you used on premise and reuse it up in the cloud. That's pretty convenient if you are doing a lift and shift model to be able to reuse the same subscriptions. You are able to spin up new instances using our Quick Start templates or marketplace offering, which means you're not looking at having to bundle up your own VHD and slog it up to the cloud. You can basically take advantage of the built-in capabilities we've got to just get yourself going. So it's got to be a few pros and cons with this approach. Theresa, how about you hit up the pros, would you?
Sure. So let's take a look at some of the pros. You may not notice, but VMs are very flexible, and it brings a great parity between on-premise and cloud, as mentioned earlier. This way, it allows you to do the least amount of change, and this is important when you need more control over what's being moved from on-premise to the cloud. It also helps with compliance and issues where you need to have more control over your deployment, especially when you're debugging and looking into logs and things like that, and you want to see exactly what's going on. IaaS is a great place to start. You can also scale this. So with VMs, you can scale it as many as you want. With VMSS, you can auto-scale up to 1,000 VMs. So this is fantastic for capacity planning or any kind of issues that you want to set to as a default and not have to monitor it every day. Also, you can network it. You can set up load balancers, gateways. There's a whole slew of products that you can work around with networking and make it more efficient for your workload. And of all these services on Azure, pricing-wise, IaaS is probably the lowest and most effective to get started. So, Christina, you want to talk about some of the cons of IaaS?
Sure. So the cons, well, you're back into managing your systems, right? So you're not so much back into it, but you don't escape it. Just like you have on premises, you have to manage your operating system. You have to manage your app servers. So as you want to do patches and upgrades, then you're on the hook to try to chase that down. So that's something to keep in mind. If you don't have an IT shop, you would probably need to build that sort of muscle to take care of it if you were changing vendors, for example. Logging and automation, while we have logging on the virtual machines themselves and their availability, if you want to talk about the logging and monitoring that's tied to your applications, you have to wire that up. You will need to set up like App Insights for capturing your logs. That's the Azure tool service we use for that, or to trigger alerts or to do metrics. But that's not in there out of the box. You will have to set that up if you do want that. On the networking side, it's incredibly flexible, like Theresa noted, but it's also incredibly complex for the people who are not used to dealing with networking. When they talk about, access control lists or web application firewalls or gateways, etc., if you don't know this technology, then you're going to have a steep ramp associated with picking up the necessary acumen to handle your workloads in the cloud. So again, you may need IT pro help to manage your systems. But all that said and done, it is still the most flexible. And with that, why don't we go and watch a demo of what it would take to deploy JBoss EAP on Azure virtual machines.
Hello, my name is Theresa Nguyen. I'm a program manager in Azure Compute. In this tutorial, we'll take a look at how to deploy JBoss EAP on Azure VMSS, also known as Virtual Machine Scale Set. We'll be using the Azure Quick Start template to demonstrate this feature. In this Azure Quick Start template page, type in JBoss in the search field. Your tiles will show up. In this case, we'll use JBoss EAP on RHEL. It's going to be running as a cluster configuration on VMSS. Once you've selected your template, you have a choice to deploy it directly to Azure by clicking on the left button, where it will take you to the Azure portal, or you can browse GitHub. If you browse GitHub, you'll see in the README file here, it'll cover everything from solution overview to architecture, costs, and all the parameters necessary to spin up your instance and also to validate your deployment. Now that we're in the Azure portal, you see here it's all the necessary parameter in order to instantiate your virtual machine scale set with JBoss EAP and RHEL already installed and pre-configured. Before we get started, let's take a look at the Red Hat account. If you're an existing customer, log in here. This is where your credential. It's also known as your pool ID. This is for EAP and RHEL. If you're new to Red Hat or JBoss, click on the Register Now button and create a new account. So now we're in the Azure portal. Let's get started by setting your subscription ID and your resource group. You can use an existing one or create a new one by clicking on Create New and typing your new name. Now let's set your region. In this case, we'll set West US 2. I want to point out that if you want to set up a jump box to validate your deployment, make sure it's in the same region as your VMSS scale set. Next, we'll enter in the admin username and password. This is how you would access your RHEL VM. For authentication type, you have a choice between password and SSH public key. For this demo, we'll use password. Next, you'll enter in the EAP RHEL version. You have a choice here between EAP 7.2 and 7.3. For RHEL, you have a choice of 7.7, 8.0. You can mix and match, so pick the best combination for your deployment. The next parameter, we'll look at the JBoss EAP username and password. This is how you access your JBoss server admin console. For your RHEL OS license type, you have a choice between pay-as-you-go or BYOS. Pay-as-you-go is metered and BYOS is bringing a subscription, and this is the best choice for existing JBoss customer who wants to bring their on-premise subscription to Azure. Next, you want to set your RHSM username and password. This is the same username and password you would log into your Red Hat account. Stepping back a little bit, let's take a look at the RHEL OS license type. If you're a pay-as-you-go, you would only have to enter in your RHSM pool ID for EAP. Since EAP is only offered as a BYOS SKU on Azure, if you select BYOS for your OS, you would have to enter your EAP pool ID as well as your RHEL pool ID. Next, you want to set your session replication strategy by clicking down the drop-down menu on the right. In here, you have a choice of your storage replication. Pick the one that best suits you. Then you want to name your virtual machine scale set. This is the name for your cluster. The instant count is the number of VMs you want to start with in your VMSS scale set. And then next you want to set your VM size. You have a choice of 9 different VMs here. If you're happy with all your selection, click Review and Create. Once all your parameters has been validated, you'll get a green bar on the top. Then you can click on Create button on the bottom left. Your deployment's in progress. You can see here all your resources being provisioned. Once it's finished, you see that your status will change to your deployment is complete. You can click on the output where it'll take you to your app URL. You can copy and paste that into your browser and test out your sample app. If you want to take your resource group, you can see your VMSS scale set has been provisioned along with your load balancer, storage account, and your VNet. If you want to take a look at your instances, you can click on the VMSS, click on the instance on the left-hand side. You'll see the 3 VMs that you provisioned are up and running. Here's the best part about VMSS. You can set your scaling up to 1,000 VMs by doing a manual scale or a custom auto scale. For manual scaling, you can set your digit or you can grab the sliding scale to scale up or down your scale set. If you want to do custom auto scale, this is how you would select that. This will allow you to set scale-based metrics. You can also set your default value, your min and your max value. Now that your deployment is up and ready, let's validate your deployment by going to the admin console. Put your public URL in the browser. This page will show up. You want to click on the admin console. In this case, it'll go to port 9000. And in here, you see your deployment. You can click on the deployments there where your application will be stored. In here, you see there's a sample EAP session replication application in the context root. You can click on that hyperlink. All right, we successfully deployed a JBoss EAP VMSS cluster on RHEL. So let's take a look at the sample application and test it out. So in the bottom here, you'll notice there's 2 buttons, incremental counter and refresh. Every time you click that, the value attribute will increase. That's how you know that your application is working. On the top here is your session ID, and at the bottom here is your VM IP address. The clustering logic that JBoss uses failover. So while you're clicking incremental counter or refresh, you'll notice that your VM will stay the same. But however, if one of your VM crashes, you'll notice that this VM would change, but then your session ID will still stay the same. That's how you know that your clustering and failover is working. Thank you for checking out this demo. I hope this experience will show you how easy it is to deploy Red Hat JBoss EAP on Azure VMSS.
All right, so why don't we jump into next about Kubernetes as a service. Theresa, even though you did the demo, you want to keep going and talk a little bit about KaaS?
Sure. So our Kubernetes service, we have 2 major offerings. One is AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. This is our first-party service. It has excellent tooling with everything else that we provide, such as VS Code, Azure DevOps, you name it. It's baked in there and it's ready to go. The next one is Azure Red Hat OpenShift. We co-developed this with partnership with Red Hat, and we have offered this as a managed tier where we have anything from integrated support all the way from the infrastructure to the cluster management. With Arrow, it's dedicated, so you don't have to worry about running production deployment. You'll be covered by both Red Hat and Microsoft. The third option here is OCP, also known as Red Hat OpenShift Cloud Platform. This is OpenShift Cloud Platform where you would have to manage yourself. It's great for Red Hat customers who want to have a multi-cloud type of approach because you can run your Kubernetes service in Google Cloud, Amazon, or Azure, or all 3. It's really up to you. So it adds great flexibility and choice to the consumer. So in the KaaS service, we support templated deployments, marketplace offers, and also custom containers. And when you deploy your cluster, you'll see in the operator, you can make the selections that way. I think this covers pretty much the high level of KaaS. Do you want to maybe take a look at what's the type of workload that's supported by Kubernetes Service? Christina?
Sure, Theresa. With KaaS, Kubernetes as a Service, you can host pretty much any Java workload that you already have in a container. Basically, anything that drops into a Docker container or even a Windows container, you can run in Kubernetes, at least on Azure. This is great because you could take everything from Pojo application to something far more elaborate, and you can deploy it easily in your Arrow or AKS deployment. It's fantastic for doing greenfield or modern app development that's focused on the cloud. It doesn't have all the orchestration layers that you would require on premise. That's been replaced with essentially the orchestration layer you get with Kubernetes. So when you switch your model from, say, app server development to cloud native, you would take advantage of the things built inherently to Kubernetes rather than trying to add layers upon layers. That said, there's a lot to be said for lifting and shifting existing containers to Kubernetes to replat to the cloud. And speaking of cloud native, there's a few things that really help with that. Quarkus is a new framework language that really makes it simpler to adopt, at least in the Java workload space, adopt cloud technologies. And we can't, of course, ignore Spring Boot applications, which are heavily used by people worldwide. All of these fit very nicely with Kubernetes as a model. But we don't have the same level of marketplace and gallery experiences quite as much as we do with IaaS and PaaS, just because this is more of your cloud native space rather than otherwise, than traditional. With that said, why don't we dive into a little bit on the pros and cons of using Kubernetes to host your workload. I know it's a Kubernetes focused conference, but there are, God help me, a few negatives tied to it, or I'll say cons, or less pros. Either way, take us in there, would you, Theresa?
Sure. So I'll start with the pros and you can do the cons.
Yes.
I like that. All right.
I like the cons.
So the pros with Kubernetes services, it is an open source implementation for scaling your apps. So in a similar way, you can take a look at it. So it functions similarly to application servers on premise. And since it's open source and it's created to basically work in any cloud, you can take this and move it from cloud to cloud. So that portability is there. You don't have to worry about the vendor lock-in. Similar to VMSS, it can scale up to 1,000 nodes. And then the next benefit that you might want to, or you already know of, is the cloud native application focus, centered around greenfield application rather than lift and shift. So again, this is better for the more modern type of application development. If you're a traditional Java EE shop, KaaS might be a rather challenging effort to move, especially for the bigger workloads. And if you're looking into developing microservices, KaaS is also a good way for it. So again, it does support frameworks such as Quarkus, which is implementation of microprofile, and also Spring Boot. As I mentioned earlier, multi-cloud Kubernetes has been implemented by virtually all the major cloud players out there. So if you don't like one cloud, you can always move to the next. So why don't you take away and talk to us about the cons, Christina?
Sure, cons. Well, Kubernetes, as powerful as it is new and it's complex. So there is a steep learning curve. If you don't already know Kubernetes, then don't assume it's going to come naturally or very quickly and easily. It's not like, oh, I need to be there by the end of the week. Kubernetes may not be the right platform of choice. It's fantastic once you've learned it, but it will take some learning. You are back to still managing the operating system for your containers. Containers, of course, have their own OS associated with whatever you wish to deploy in it, so you have to manage it, update it, etc. You don't escape that. It does require you to have trained personnel to manage this. So again, like with VMs and VMSS, you haven't escaped needing IT pros. You will need people who are very savvy on your system, which may or may not be your dev shop or not. Depends on the model you work with. For a small scale application, Kubernetes is a bit overweight. It's like going shopping and getting a loaf of bread, and yet you're driving a tractor trailer to get your loaf of bread. it's not suited really for that. But on the other hand, you want to get a truckload of bread, then Kubernetes is fantastic. It scales quite nicely and can handle all sorts of amazing production workloads. It doesn't really do the best for lift and shift because unless you're already in Kubernetes on-prem, which if so, great job. But if you're not, then you're looking at a difference in how things are run. You're looking at a lot of rework. Basically it's straight up. Even if you're on containers, but you're not on Kubernetes, you're going to have some overhead associated with ramping up on Kubernetes. If you want to get load balancing and all the rest of these different features and services, you will have to plug in what you want to be exposed. You do have to do the plumbing. Just taking a container and dropping it up there doesn't automatically give you X, Y, and Z. You will have to configure your system. And then there's the associated resource costs. We talked about human resources, but there's also the deployment resources, your networking, your developer expertise. All these need to be developed, and so something to keep in mind. Why don't we dive in talking about PaaS? And since this is my hood, I'm going to talk about the service itself. Change things up from the earlier ones, Theresa. So PaaS is Platform as a Service. This is basically where you get a lot of built-in capabilities from a service that allow you to host your applications. It has features such as OS maintenance, security patching, deployment enablement. In the case of App Service, we integrate nicely with a variety of CI/CD systems. We've got built-in networking features so you can plug in to different networks, whether it's an Azure Virtual Network or whether it's something on-premise. We've got a lot of compliance oversight to ensure you can host your production workloads regardless of the certification level on Azure App Service. Now, I did focus that a little bit on Azure App Service because by and large, it is a bit of a differentiator. There are not really any other PaaS services out there except maybe like Heroku or GAE, but GAE you have to often refactor code for, and Amazon doesn't really directly do one. Not to say that I'm picking on them, I guess I am, but I shouldn't do that. But it is something that's a little bit more unique, I guess, to Azure. So I may speak a little bit more Azure-centric here than I would have in generalized terms elsewhere. So with that said, Theresa, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the Java workloads you can host at least in Azure App Service, and we can go from there.
Sure. So some of the applications you can run are Jakarta and Java EE. As we know today, a lot of the workloads are probably still running on Java EE spec. If, however, you're a little bit more ahead of the game and on Jakarta EE, such as the Red Hat JBoss EAP, supports both implementation, you can run it on App Service. The other type of workload is Java SE, which you might know as Tomcat, Spring, or Jetty. You can also run in kind of Pojo apps. And along with this, we have migration tooling that will help you migrate from your on-premise to the cloud and also run it on Linux. Yes, we do love Linux on Microsoft. So for the partnership that we mentioned earlier with with Red Hat, JBoss EAP is now in public preview with App Service. It's a pay-as-you-go model where you only pay for what you use. It also includes integrated support, so you don't have to worry about the app server or the infrastructure. We'll take care of it, and it caters to whatever you want to deploy. So on a traditional Java EE type of deployment, if you have a mix between ER, WAR, and jar files, or you can deploy all of them into Azure App Service. So Christina, I know this is your favorite part, but maybe you can dive into some pros and cons about your service.
Cons. We have no cons. But let me talk about the pros. All right, so we manage the OS for you. We maintain it. We apply patches. So, hey, you're off the hook. Score. Framework management, things like JBoss EAP, which is our common example, are taken care of. We will maintain and update those versions, albeit it's not like we're going to upgrade it without your permission. You can choose which JBoss EAP or Tomcat version you're using. Right now, JBoss EAP, we only have one version at the time of this recording because it's just went into public preview, but we've got a slew of other versions of Tomcat and others. Microsoft Azure has supported Java on App Service since 2014, albeit for most of that time it was on Windows, and 2018 moved to Linux as well. That's where most of our focus is. So we've got a lot of Java customers pre-existing, tens of thousands of them sitting on App Service, so you're not alone if you do choose us. Features, we've got a lot of developer enhancements built into the product. We plug in nicely with different IDEs. We've got, like I noted earlier, integration to different CI/CD pipelines. It's fantastic to accelerating developer productivity. Built-in networking connectivity features, those enhance your ability to reach your remote resources, etc. Security, we've got SSL, and we've got integration with Azure Active Directory. You can pick a cloud authority that you wish to use for identity, and that makes life a lot easier. We don't force you just to use AAD. You could use somebody else. I won't list all the competitors, but yeah, they're there. Scale, you can do it easily with the drag of a mouse, or you could set auto scale based on metrics such as CPU or memory, etc., and the system will scale out horizontally. And built-in HA, so we run with spare compute, so that if your workload, the VM that you're on somehow dies, then we've got a spare, or when we do upgrades, we bring it up on there before we upgrade the host that your workload is on. We ensure your systems are operational, albeit anybody who wants to maintain uptime with their app should run at least 2 instances, because your workload could crash for its own reason if you had a bug, and so you want to have at least 2 instances in case your app goes down for whatever reason. So on the pros, it's a really powerful service. So just on the off chance somebody could come up with a con, I'll let Theresa take a stab at it, but tried and works with machine.
All right, here's my list of cons.
Oh no.
All right, flexibility. Well, you can't really change the OS settings or any items in the framework, but that's the trade-off. You get them to manage everything else for you. Your host access, while there's a shell, you can't really access the host. So, again, limitation, unlike VMs and VMSS, where you have direct access. In terms of scale, you can scale up to 100 instances, where VMs and VMSS, again, I know I'm talking a lot about it, but you can scale up to 1,000 instances. So it doesn't support stateful services at this time, but maybe it'll change later on. And also supports custom container, but like everything else, you run your custom container, you own everything else on the inside, just like AKS, Arrow, and OpenShift. And I do want to mention one other cons, just for now, is JBoss EAP in App Service is available in public preview, so there's no SLA, but it's great to test it out, to do your POCs, but once it goes to GA, you will have integrated support. So with that said, Christina, maybe we can take a look at a demo on that?
Yeah, let's take a look at a demo. All right.
Hello, my name is Jason Freeberg. I'm a program manager on Azure App Service, and today we are going to create a JBoss EAP site on App Service, and then we're going to deploy an application onto JBoss, and then finally we're going to configure the JBoss server to communicate with my Postgres server that I already have created here. So we're already in the Azure portal, so first thing I'm going to do is come over here to create a resource, and then we're going to create a new web app. And here I'm going to select my resource group, and then here I'm going to give a name for the site, so we'll call this JBoss Demo 3. And then here we're going to deploy code. You can also deploy custom Docker containers if you have your own image that you maintain. But here we're just going to deploy code, and so on a runtime stack, here I select JBoss EAP 7.2, and this is currently in technical preview, running on Java 8. So I'll select that. Here I can choose my region. Central US is fine. And then finally, my app service plan is essentially the compute tier for this site. So here I'm running on our premium SKU. And now I will click Review and Create. So this gives me an overview where I can look over my selections, and then finally I'll hit create. And so this will create my site on top of that app service plan. Okay, great. So the resource is created. So let's go ahead and browse to it. So here I'm looking at the overview for my app service. And on the left-hand side, we can see that there's pages where I can set up CI/CD, where I can do configuration. I can also scale out to more instances or scale up to a better hardware tier. But first things first, let's go ahead and deploy a app onto our JBoss site. So let me pull up PowerShell here. And now I'm going to use the Azure PowerShell commandlet to deploy a WAR file. So here we have publish AZ web app. I'm pointing to my resource group, which was Freeburg demo, and then my application name. And then here I'm pointing to a WAR app that I created earlier. So we'll run this. We'll ask for a confirmation. And now we'll run this command. Okay, great. So the deployment went through, and here I have some summary output about the site. So let's go back to the portal. Let's check on our site here. Perfect. So here's my demo application. It's just a pet store where you can buy some animals. And then let's hop back over here. So now what we want to do is configure the JBoss server to communicate with my Postgres database. So I need to deploy some configuration files onto the server. So the first thing I have is my JDBC driver, and then I have the module descriptor for the JDBC driver, and then I have some CLI commands for the JBoss CLI that will add the module, register the data source, and then finally add the data source to the session. And then finally here I have a startup script because app service is a stateless service. So these configurations need to be executed every time the container starts. So by starting this startup script every time the container comes up, every container will be configured the same. So now we're just going to FTP these files onto my web app. So here I'm selecting those 4, and we're going to deploy those up to the container. Perfect. Okay. So we have those dependencies up. The next thing we're going to do is come over into the configuration blade. And then here on the startup command, we're going to point to that startup script. So now every time that the container starts, the startup script will be executed, and that will configure our JBoss server. Cool. Awesome. The next thing I have to do is set my connection strings for the Postgres database. So let's bring over PowerShell. And here I'm going to use the Azure CLI, point to my resource group, point to the JBoss site, and I'm going to set app settings, which are essentially environment variables, for my connection URL, my admin password, and the username for the database. So we'll run this. Perfect. So here, this tells me that my connection strings were set. And now if I refresh the portal here, we should see that I've got my app settings set right there. So perfect. So now let's go down the left-hand side here, and we'll use SSH to get inside the container, and we can make sure that the JBoss server is configured correctly. So first thing I'm going to do is connect to the JBoss CLI. Then we're going to read the data sources that are configured. And so here we can see Postgres is listed as a data source, which is a good sign. And now we're going to test the connection. Perfect. Okay, so outcome success. So the JBoss server is configured correctly. And now our next step is going to be to redeploy our application to use JBoss. So let's close the old version. All right, so our next step is to configure our sample application to use Postgres. So here we'll pull up the persistence XML definition file. And now, before it was just using an in-memory database called example data source, DS. Now we're going to set this to Postgres DS. Perfect, so we'll save that. And now we will rebuild the application. We're skipping tests for the sake of brevity, but don't do this in production. Awesome. And now we're going to use the same command as before, publish AZ web app to deploy the application. So we'll run this, confirm, and cool, there we go. So we've got some summary output here. So now let's move this out of the way. All right, now we're back in the portal, so we'll hit browse. Perfect, okay. So this particular application is configured so that if it can't connect to the data source, then it won't start up. So since we changed the data source to Postgres and redeployed, and since it's running, we know that it's talking to Postgres correctly. Awesome, hope you enjoyed the demo. For more information, you can go to our app service blog, aka ms/app service blog. Keep up to date on our latest information. And actually right here is our article on Postgres, on JBoss EAP.
That was a pretty cool demo. So yes, App Service makes it pretty easy. Just a drop down and you can select something like JBoss EAP. I'd call that easier. So, but fine, details. All right, cloud native and modern apps. So since we're talking about the different services, it's very important to bring up one of the key differentiators between how you look at your cloud hosting. Whether you've got greenfield new application development or you've got lift and shift, you've got to keep in mind what's your intent as you move to the cloud, because that will drive the service you select, or it should be the main driver. So to do that, let's describe a little bit more about what a cloud native model is. So this would be cloud-focused applications. That would be cases like where you're going to take advantage of services in the cloud rather than your on-premise hosted systems. Examples might be like caching services or storage services or SQL services, etc., that are available from a cloud vendor. You might take advantage of capabilities such as Kubernetes that allow a cloud-agnostic deployment model for your applications. And so this is more of your cloud-native reality. New application development. Your legacy deployments that you have on-premise weren't using services in some cloud vendor, whether it's Azure, AWS, or GCP, or anybody else. They were taking advantage of software deployments you probably had all on premises and that were meshed locally. So changing how all that works is a big deal. So cloud agnostic-ish, I call it agnostic-ish because the reality is that there are going to be differences between the different services with each of the different vendors. Storage is not truly storage. I mean, it is, but the contract you have to get it will vary with your vendor. And these things can be abstracted away to some degree with SDKs or other systems, but you will almost always have to make some adjustments with the fact that you're moving your code from one vendor to another. Then there's the bleeding edge aspect. So a lot of people think that the danger in having something brand new is that, oh, it might break or fall down. That's not so much the big liability here. the biggest thing is something could be too new for you to use without being stuck out there on a ledge, right? How do you get resources to develop in it, to manage and maintain it? You usually will want something to have been around a little bit of time so that there's a measure of expertise that you can take advantage of, and it doesn't hurt that the quality of the product could be higher due to a longer runtime. But that's cloud native in a nutshell. But why don't we talk a little bit then about lift and shift, Theresa?
Sure. Lift and shift, I'm sure you heard of this again and again and all over again. Well, migration of workloads from on-premise to Azure, as you can see, it's becoming more and more pervasive as the technology's gotten better and more services are available, and security is definitely beefing up over the decades. So it's suitable for savings when you have data centers that are shutting down, or you have vendors that are strong-arming you into signing a 1-year contract to maybe a 10-year contract. So it's a good time to revisit some of these dollars and commitments. And also when you want to consolidate your providers, managing 1,000 vendors versus like a handful of vendors might be a way to cut costs through administration and also through expenses. And the reduction of ISV contracts and complicated contract management, because like everything else, the more you have to manage. So eliminating some of these hardware and all these expectations by moving to the cloud, you're really enabling your time, your resources, and your developers to focus on what they want to do and work on the application rather than managing hardware and software. So the last point I want to point out is if you want to grow your data center fast as well, lifting shifting might be a better way to do it, because you then can take advantage of something like Azure, where we have data centers all around the world, and we have built-in redundancy and reliability and security measures, you name it. Everything that you want is there, and you can get it easily. Where if you do it on your own premise or through a hosted data center, you have to consider how to scale, how do you test it, and it just, over time, you're looking at a really big budget and also timeline to get everything out the door. So this is what lift and shift is about. Moving from an on-premise setup or a hosted data center into the cloud, and with the most minimal changes and also the most cost-effective way. And as your portfolio strategy adopts newer technology, you can do that in the cloud in parallel to your existing applications, especially your monolith type of architecture. So, Christina, let's take a look at what other drivers that are driving, especially this year in 2020. For migration.
Sure. So on that, let's talk about the recent COVID crisis. So the past year has been ridiculous in so many ways, but the impact of COVID has been, it's been felt in many sectors. But one aspect is on how many people now stay at home, whether they're working from home or they're just trapped at home. People are using the internet basically to socialize, to get their work accomplished, etc. And this has driven a massive demand on cloud-hosted resources. This has had an impact in a few ways. One is that supply chains have been hit hard. Not only do they have to struggle with their workers who could be sick or ill or whatever, but the demand is very high, and so supply chain's been very problematic. So this has the impact that if you wanted to build up your local data center, you're going to have a harder time adding capacity for your services that you're providing, which means it's really quick and easy instead to look at going to a cloud vendor. So with that, Theresa, can you close this out?
Sure. So let's wrap this up. So we've covered the 3 major categories of services that you can run in the cloud: IaaS, PaaS, and KaaS. Hopefully we've captured enough pros and cons for you to help make a decision better. So here we've included some resources for you to take a look at. Some of it is on JBoss EAPs, because that's what we've been doing our demo on. You can see as a baseline of how easy or hard it is to run on the 3 different infrastructure. Thank you again for attending our session.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to work on this with Theresa. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of the conference.